November 1971. The frigid, churning waters of the North Pacific, southwest of the Aleutian Trench. The air inside the torpedo room of the USS Halibut was a claustrophobic mix of stale oxygen, ozone from electrical banks, and the metallic tang of diesel fuel, a stark contrast to the -2 ring operator sea water pressing relentlessly against the hull outside. Chief Petty Officer James Jamie Sullivan ran a gloved hand across the damp, rivet-studded curvature of the pressure hull, feeling the rhythmic, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the steel. The very sound of the massive, converted nuclear submarine pushing through the crushing darkness at an agonizing 2 knots. Halibut wasn't built for speed. She was built for silence and for the deep, a veteran hunter refitted with a unique, classified mission profile. Her Regulus missile hangar, once designed to launch nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, had been gutted and converted into a pressurized ocean engineering laboratory, the euphemism for a specialized diving chamber and deployment bay for miniature submersibles and ROVs. Jamie checked the status lights on the monitoring panel for the DSRV, Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, lockout hatch. The indicator remained stubbornly red. No dive operations permitted. They were still too far from the target zone, a designated section of the Sea of Okhotsk that the Soviet Navy considered its personal, impenetrable backyard, a vast, shallow continental shelf, riddled with patrol routes, listening arrays, and the constant, unnerving presence of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's nuclear ballistic missile submarine, SSBN, patrol areas. The air in the torpedo room was tense, thick with the unspoken knowledge that they were venturing into a 160,000 square mile Soviet lake, a place where, if caught, their rescue would be impossible and their mission a geopolitical catastrophe. Commander Steve Cavanaugh, a man whose face was a roadmap of stress lines and whose uniform seemed perpetually rumpled, slid into the adjacent control seat. His voice was a low, disciplined murmur, cutting through the background noise of the SQR-17 sonar, pinging intermittently into the void. Status, Chief? Steady as she goes, Commander. 380 feet. Water temperature is dropping, pressure holding. Engine room reports minimal fluctuation. They're keeping the noise profile lower than a whisper, running on the secondary battery banks for extended periods. We're pushing the endurance envelopes. Good. Tell them to keep it up. We need to be invisible. The VLF, very low frequency, broadcasts from Petropavlovsk are too loud here. We'll be closing on the Kuril chain tomorrow. I want absolute silence after we cross the line. No active sonar. Passive only. We're going to rely entirely on the fish to find the cable. The fish was the affectionate, slightly morbid nickname for the search and recovery vehicle, SCRV. A custom-built, 20-foot-long unmanned submersible bristling with advanced magnetic sensors and side-scan sonar. Its job, to find a single, buried, 3-inch wide cable. The main, hardened communications link connecting the Soviet Pacific Fleet's headquarters in Vladivostok to its critical SSBN bases on the Kamchatka Peninsula. The intelligence objective, codenamed Operation Ivy Bells, was audacious to the point of insanity. To physically tap into the cable, record the transmissions, and retrieve the data, all without leaving a trace that would alarm the highly paranoid Soviet security apparatus. It was a gamble of epic proportions, betting the life of a submarine and its 115-man crew on the audacity of a single, secret cable. Cavanaugh leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the illuminated bathymetric chart detailing the complex, jagged seafloor topography ahead. The Soviets trust their geography, Chief. They believe that their minefields, their patrol ships, and the sheer hostility of the Okhotsk are enough. They believe the ice in the winter and the 500-meter depth are their security guarantees. We're about to prove them wrong. He paused, a grim smile touching his lips. They'll never suspect a submarine this size could get in, much less sit on the bottom for weeks. The true test, however, wasn't getting in. It was the inevitable, nerve-shredding moment when they would have to find that tiny line of communication in the vast darkness and, somehow, listen to the deepest secrets of the Soviet Cold War machine. The next 72 hours were a blur of hushed commands and agonizingly slow movement. The USS Halibut crept, a massive steel phantom, through the treacherous, current-swept passages of the Kuril Islands. This chain of volcanic landmasses, stretching from Japan's Hokkaido up toward the Kamchatka Peninsula, was the geological and geopolitical barrier to the Sea of Okhotsk. The Soviets treated the straits like a highly guarded turnstile. Aboard Halibut, every unnecessary system was shut down. The air conditioning was minimal. The temperature inside the control room hovered around 10 ring operator C, and condensation beaded on the steel bulkheads. Crewmen moved in slow motion, wearing extra layers of wool. The only sound was the hydrophone operator's quiet breathing and the occasional, barely audible tick of the chronometer. Commander Kavanaugh stood motionless by the sonar repeater, his eyes glued to the display. The water was noisy here, biological sounds, the grinding of ice floes far above, and, most ominously, the distant, thumping rhythm of Soviet trawlers and naval patrols. Target bearing 045 ring operator, range 6,000 yards, whispered Ensign David Chun, the youngest officer on board, his voice strained with concentration. Classification: probable Soviet Kashin-class destroyer. Speed 12 knots. Sound profile suggests active MGK -345, Bronza, sonar operating intermittently. Kavanaugh held up a single, gloved hand. Wait. The Kashin was heading directly for their projected position. The ship was a notorious noisemaker, its gas turbines screaming underwater, but its sonar could easily pierce Halibut's carefully cultivated shroud of silence. They were too close to the surface, the depth dictated by the need to navigate the straits without scraping the bottom. Helm, execute course 180 ring operator, Kavanaugh ordered, his voice still low but firm. 1 degree of rudder, very slow. Drop to 600 feet. Let's use the thermal layer below us for shielding. We will pass underneath him. The massive 5,000-ton submarine began its subtle, deliberate descent. The pressure hull gave off a few muffled groans, the acoustic signature of steel adjusting to the increasing pressure, sounds that, to the crew, felt deafeningly loud. For 18 minutes, they held their breath. The Kashin's propeller cavitation grew to a crescendo directly overhead, a terrifying, grinding roar that filled the acoustic space in the control room. Chief Sullivan watched the sonar screen, feeling the vibrations through his boots. The Soviet destroyer passed, its sound fading slowly toward the north. Clear, Ensign Chun breathed, slumping slightly in his chair. Not clear, Kavanaugh corrected immediately. We are in the Sea of Okhotsk. We are behind their curtain. From this moment on, we are no longer just evading. We are hunting. We are now in the designated operating area, codenamed Paradise Valley. Helm, set course 010 ring operator to the first search box. Deploy the fish. Let's find that goddamn cable. The mission, Operation Ivy Bells, had officially begun. The vast, hostile ocean floor of the Soviet bastion now lay ahead, and somewhere beneath its silt lay the single thread that promised to unravel Moscow's most protected naval secrets. The designated Paradise Valley was a deceptive name for a section of seabed that was anything but tranquil. It was a shifting landscape of volcanic muck, deep trenches, and occasional rock outcroppings, all covered in a fine layer of silt kicked up by the deep-sea currents. The target, the communication cable, was thought to run from the heavily fortified naval base near Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky south toward the Central Command Network near Vladivostok. Intelligence estimates placed it at a depth averaging 450 meters, but its exact path was classified by the Soviets with the same rigor they applied to their strategic missile sites. The 20-foot search and recovery vehicle, a CRV, nicknamed the Fish, was deployed from Halibut's converted hangar bay. Operated remotely from the control room by a team of highly specialized technicians, the Fish was their eyes and ears on the bottom. Its mission, a slow, meticulous sweep pattern, dragging a 300-foot sensor array equipped with ultra-sensitive magnetometers. The cable, even when armored and buried, was expected to create a minute magnetic anomaly that the sensors could detect. For 5 days, the search was a grueling exercise in patience and frustration. The operators, led by Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, stared into the low-light video feed from the fish, watching endless, monotonous footage of dark silt and occasional benthic life. Every metallic object, discarded fishing gear, volcanic rocks with high iron content, even deep-sea debris, registered as a false positive, causing a spike of adrenaline followed by the deflating reality of another dead end. Contact. Bearing 210 ring operator, Thorne suddenly announced, his voice snapping the tension in the control room. The magnetometer trace on the screen spiked sharply and then held steady, a perfect, clean signal. This is different. It's a clean, linear signature. Low-level magnetic shielding, consistent with a major undersea cable, Commander. Commander Kavanaugh leaned over Thorne's shoulder, his breath held. Check the width profile. Is it consistent with the target specifications? The K-200 cable? Thorne worked the controls, maneuvering the fish closer, activating its high-resolution sub-bottom sonar. The screen resolved the image. A faint, buried trace in the silt, a perfect cylindrical shape about 3 inches in diameter. Affirmative, Commander. Signature matches the K-200 profile. We have found it. The link between their boomer subs and command. Depth of burial is minimal, maybe 2 feet of silt. A collective, silent breath was released in the control room. The tension didn't dissipate. It simply transformed from the anxiety of the hunt to the terror of execution. They were now sitting 500 yards away from the main communications artery of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, a cable that could be monitored, booby-trapped, or protected by patrol sweeps they hadn't yet detected. Chief Sullivan, Kavanaugh said, turning to the engineering chief, prepare the halibut for bottoming. We're going to settle right here, using the trench lip for cover. We tapped this line tonight. The plan was audacious. They would not just monitor from afar. They would physically place a sophisticated, custom-built tapping device, the pod, directly onto the cable, a task requiring the utmost precision, silence, and hours of vulnerable presence on the exposed seabed. Bottoming a massive nuclear submarine, especially a refitted veteran like the USS Halibut, was an operation that bordered on reckless. The immense weight of the 350-foot hull had to be settled gently onto the unstable silt of the seabed, ensuring the boat didn't slide into the deeper parts of the trench or, worse, become irrevocably stuck. Kavanaugh guided the boat into a small, acoustically advantageous pocket they had identified, a slight depression nestled beside a 30-foot rock formation that would help mask their massive 5,000-ton presence from distant Soviet hydrophone arrays. Chief Sullivan's team meticulously adjusted the trim and ballast tanks, using minute injections of compressed air and seawater to achieve negative buoyancy. The submarine's descent slowed to inches per minute. In the control room, every man could hear the faint, gritty sound of the silt compacting under the hull as Halibut finally rested. The time was 2 o'clock hours. The depth gauge read 462 meters. We are bottomed, Commander, Sullivan reported, the relief evident in his low voice. Pressure holding. Hull integrity confirmed. We are running on minimum battery power only. Acoustic signature is 0, save for the crew's breathing. Kavanaugh nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders only to be immediately replaced by a heavier one. Good. Now for the hard part. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, you have the con. Initiate preparation for pod deployment. I want the hangar pressurized and the lockout chamber checked twice. We are only doing this once. The pod was the crown jewel of Operation Ivy Bells. It was a 6-ton, 15-foot-long cylindrical device, encased in hardened titanium and designed to perform 2 miracles. First, to acoustically and magnetically mimic a natural rock formation, making it invisible to Soviet sensors. And second, to inductively couple with a high-frequency communication cable without ever physically penetrating the protective armor. The data would be recorded on vast reels of magnetic tape inside the pod, which would be retrieved by Halibut months later. The actual deployment required the use of the DSRV, Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, lockout chamber, and unprecedented use of the system. Instead of deploying divers, They would deploy a specialized remote manipulator vehicle, RMV, essentially a highly robust, tethered underwater robot with precision hydraulic arms. The RMV, nicknamed Claw, was the instrument that had to locate the 3-inch cable, gently unbury it from the silt, and then position and securely clamp the immense pod onto the line, all in total darkness and silence, against punishing deep-sea currents. As the technicians began the meticulous pressurization sequence in the hangar, a new spike of tension shot through the control room. Ensign Chun, monitoring the passive hydrophones, stiffened. "Commander, a new contact. Bearing 030, ring operator. Very faint, very slow. Sounds like a diesel-electric motor. High frequency, 80 Hz blade rate. Classification, probable Soviet Foxtrot-class patrol submarine. Moving along a suspected patrol corridor, roughly 15 miles away." The 15 miles was a universe away at their 2-knot cruising speed, but Halibut was bottomed and immobile. They were sitting target if the Foxtrot chose to turn their way, or if its acoustic array caught the minuscule sound of the hydraulic systems pressurizing the hangar. The next few hours of deployment would be a terrifying race against the unpredictable movements of a predator they couldn't outrun. Lieutenant Commander Thorne gripped the controls for the RMV Claw, his focus absolute. The 1,500-watt floodlights on the robot were the only illumination in the crushing blackness outside. On the monitor, the scene was ghostly. The huge bulk of the pod was visible, suspended by its umbilical cable just above the seabed. The tiny, articulated arms of the Claw were tasked with maneuvering this immense weight. The first critical step was locating the cable again. Thorne nudged the Claw's forward thrusters. A cloud of fine silt bloomed in the beam, momentarily obscuring the view. As it settled, he found a faint ridge the earlier search had identified. The 3-inch communication line, buried beneath a thin layer of sediment. "Commander, the Foxtrot is holding its course, but the blade rate is erratic, suggests intermittent speed changes," Ensign Chun reported, his voice a tight whisper. "Range 12 miles. If it slows or decides to do a search pattern, we have maybe 90 minutes before it's too close for comfort." Cavanaugh watched the main monitor, ignoring the growing threat. "Thorne, you heard the man. Speed is essential, but precision is non-negotiable. If you mangle the cable, the Soviets will know. This entire mission fails. Proceed with the excavation." Thorne began the delicate process. He used the Claw's wide spade attachment, designed specifically to displace silt without creating a major acoustic disturbance. The action was painstakingly slow. Seconds felt like minutes. 90 seconds to clear a 3-foot section. The silt fell away, revealing the cable's thick, armored steel sheathing, glistening faintly in the Claw's lights. Now came the terrifying maneuver, lifting the 6-ton pod and placing it directly onto the exposed cable. The pod was so large that maneuvering the Claw around it required constant vigilance to avoid accidental contact with the hull of Halibut, which would generate a massive, unmistakable metallic clang. "Bringing the pod down now, Commander," Thorne announced, his voice clipped. He used the pod's own deployment winch, controlled through the Claw, paying out the cable inch by inch. The enormous cylinder descended, a behemoth against the tiny cable. It hovered for a moment, 2 feet above the target. Then, the Foxtrot contact update sliced through the tension. Contact speed decrease. Range 9 miles. It sounds like it's slowing down to conduct passive listening or a depth change. Acoustic signature is dropping. A slowing Soviet submarine meant increased danger. It meant the crew was actively listening for anything unusual. Any mistake now would resonate through the deep water like a gunshot. Thorne ignored the report, his eyes locked on the monitor. He made the final, infinitesimal adjustments. A millimeter to the left. A hair down. The pod's specialized clamping mechanism, driven by silent hydrostatic actuators, slowly engaged. A set of laser guides confirmed the perfect centerpoint placement. Click. The sound was internal, mechanical, but the crew instinctively flinched. The pod was attached. The induction coils were now coupled to the Soviet communication cable. Thorne immediately activated the internal timer and the acoustic masking systems. Pod is secured. Clamp integrity nominal. Sensor output confirms induction lock. We are receiving signal, Thorne reported, a shaky triumph in his voice. Jesus, Kavanaugh breathed, relief mixing with profound danger. Reel in the claw. Sullivan, prepare for silent departure. We need to be gone before that foxtrot gets any closer. The tiny American submarine, bottom deep in the Soviet backyard, had just begun to listen to their most profound nuclear secrets. The tiny American submarine, bottom deep in the Soviet backyard, had just begun to listen to their most profound nuclear secrets. The retrieval of the RMV Claw and the subsequent silent departure of the USS Halibut took another 90 minutes of nerve-shredding labor. Commander Kavanaugh ordered the ballast tanks meticulously emptied, using the surrounding water pressure to slowly push the submarine off the seabed, minimizing any telltale plume of silt. They didn't engage the main propulsion until they had risen 200 feet above the bottom, gliding away silently at less than a knot, using the thermal gradients and the general acoustic noise of the ocean floor to mask their escape. Meanwhile, back in the torpedo room, now functioning as the Ocean Engineering Analysis Center, the specialists were staring at the Halibut's own temporary monitoring station, a fragile link to the pod they had left behind. The pod, designed to operate completely autonomously, was already recording, but the temporary link allowed them to confirm the quality and nature of the captured data. Lieutenant Elmer Voss, the chief cryptologist assigned to the mission, was staring at the spectral analyzer screen, his jaw slack. He adjusted the 12-inch dial, pushing the noise reduction to its limit. Commander, you need to see this. The data stream is massive. It's a high-density, multi-channel carrier wave, exactly what we expected from the K-200. But the nature of the content, he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. Kavanaugh moved to the console, staring at the rhythmic, complex energy pattern displayed on the screen, the raw electronic signature of Soviet high command talking to its deployed fleet. What is it, Voss? Is it encoded? Yes, Commander, but not to the degree we anticipated. There are multiple high-level traffic channels, fleet movements, supply orders, technical specifications. But look here. Voss pointed to a specific high-bandwidth channel that pulsed with an almost continuous, rapid-fire stream of data packets. This channel is carrying the primary communications between Vladivostok and the Kamchatka SSBM bases. It's the most sensitive traffic they have. The command and control orders for their nuclear missile fleet. Voss zoomed in on a snippet of the capture transmission, which was being run through a provisional spectrum demodulator. A pattern, clear and distinct, emerged from the noise. Their primary voice communications. Commander, they are not using single-use key encryption. Not for the majority of the transmissions. They're using an F-800 series cipher, which is complex, yes, but predictable. It's a cipher they clearly trust entirely. The implications were staggering. The U.S. Navy's Cryptanalysis Division, knowing the Cold War calculus, had spent years perfecting the ability to break Soviet code, anticipating layers of impenetrable, constantly changing encryption. The Soviets, relying on the physical security of the 450-meter seabed and the presumed impossibility of tapping the armored cable, had become complacent with their electronic security. They assumed that if the communication was physically secure, the encryption only had to be good enough to deter conventional radio interception. They were treating their highest-level naval command messages like routine phone calls. Predictable means we can build the logic to break it completely once we get the pod's tapes back to shore, Kavanaugh murmured, the danger of their mission suddenly multiplied by its sheer payoff. They're sending their SSBN patrol schedules, their maintenance windows, the locations of their acoustic surveillance nets, practically unencrypted. Worse, sir, Voss added, running a frequency analysis on the lower channels, which handled logistical traffic. Their primary logistical channel, detailing everything from nuclear warhead transport schedules to submarine repair dry dock reservations, is almost entirely plain text, minor scrambling only, almost certainly designed to fool low-level interceptors, not serious decryption efforts. They're discussing the movement of Yankee and Delta-class SSBNs as if they were ordering pizza. The silence in the torpedo room was heavy, almost reverent. The United States Navy hadn't just found a communications cable. They had found a massive, gaping wound in the very operational heart of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The intelligence dividend would be historic, giving the American submarine fleet an unprecedented, near real-time map of Soviet nuclear readiness and operations. The 6-ton pod, sitting silently on the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, had just become the single most valuable intelligence asset of the Cold War. Commander Kavanaugh's immediate priority shifted from installation to retrieval. The pod was designed to record for a maximum of 60 days before its magnetic tape reels were exhausted. Given the goldmine of information streaming into it, this time frame was now non-negotiable. Missing the retrieval window would mean the loss of the data and, potentially, the device itself if a Soviet sweep detected it later. The 115-man crew of the USS Halibut spent the next 48 hours refining the escape route and planning the return mission. Operation Ivy Bells wasn't a one-and-done deal. It was envisioned as a recurring intelligence coup. The plan necessitated two more dangerous phases: the immediate exfiltration and the subsequent return, exactly 60 days later, to retrieve the first data-filled pod and install a fresh one. We need to establish a precise grid reference for the pod beyond the standard inertial navigation system, Kavanaugh stated during the mission briefing, held in the hushed confines of the wardroom. The officers gathered around the chart, the Sea of Okhotsk rendered in stark topographical detail. The coordinates are logged, but the seabed shifts. We must have a foolproof method to find that exact spot again, silently, in a month and a half, potentially under different ice conditions. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan proposed a technical solution. Commander, before we leave, we can task the SARV Fish with deploying 3 specialized acoustic transponders, low-power, wide-dispersion beacons. We'll position them in a 500-meter equilateral triangle around the pod. Their output is minimal, buried deep in the silt, only detectable by the Fish's specialized receiver at very short range. The Soviets will never hear them, but they'll give us the triangulation we need for pinpoint accuracy on return. The risk was the deployment itself. Every minute the Fish was active increased the chance of acoustic detection. Yet the intelligence payoff justified the gamble. The Fish was deployed once more in the late afternoon of November 18, 1971. Thorne, the RMV operator, worked with the same surgical precision, burying the 3 transponders deep into the volcanic sediment, creating a silent, invisible electronic breadcrumb trail leading back to the Soviet secrets. Transponders deployed and confirmed active, Commander, Thorne reported. The Claw now safely stowed, the hangar sealed. Excellent. Now, let's get out of here, Kavanaugh ordered. The transit out of the Sea of Okhotsk was perhaps the most tense phase of the initial mission. They were now leaving behind an asset of staggering importance. The Soviets could discover the tap through a fluke patrol, a trawler snagging the line, or an unexpected deep-sea survey. Kavanaugh maintained the maximum level of silent running, navigating the dangerous Kuriil Straits with agonizing slowness. For 70 hours, the crew ate cold rations, spoke only in whispers, and held their breath against every faint ping on the hydrophones. As Halibut finally cleared the Kuriils and headed into the relative safety of the open Pacific, Kavanaugh allowed himself a single, visible exhalation of relief. He looked at the chart, tracing the long, dangerous line they had taken. They had confirmed the target, installed the tap, and escaped undetected. Now came the long wait and the even greater risk of the return mission. The data they had glimpsed, the F-800 cipher, the logistics in near-plain text, promised to fundamentally alter the naval balance of power, granting the U.S. Navy a god's-eye view of Soviet operational reality. The 60 days until the retrieval seemed an eternity, pregnant with both immense opportunity and catastrophic peril. The USS Halibut returned to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, not with the fanfare of a successful patrol, but with the utmost stealth. Her 115-man crew was debriefed under the strictest operational security protocols. Confined to the base, their achievement known only to a tight, highly vetted circle of Navy command and intelligence analysts. The initial data samples brought back by Lieutenant Voss confirmed the unbelievable. The Soviets were indeed treating the K-200 undersea cable as a fully secured terrestrial line, transmitting vast amounts of highly sensitive military information with stunningly lax encryption. The interim reports caused an immediate, top-level tremor in Washington, D.C. The Director of Naval Intelligence, DNI, Vice Admiral Bobby Inman, personally carried the raw intelligence findings, a transcript of voice and text traffic regarding the maintenance schedule of 2 Delta-class SSBNs, directly to the White House Situation Room. The meeting was attended by the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Director of the CIA. Gentlemen, the Sea of Okhotsk is, for the Soviet Pacific Fleet, an open book, Admiral Inman began, laying the deciphered transcripts on the table. They communicate the exact times their ballistic missile submarines leave their secured pens, their planned patrol routes, the status of their missile tubes, and the specific locations of their acoustic surveillance barrier, the Magnum Line, which is supposed to prevent our own SSBNs from tracking them. The reaction was a mixture of stunned disbelief and strategic euphoria. The fact that the Soviets had allowed such a colossal security lapse was almost unimaginable. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger leaned forward, tapping a pen on the document. Admiral, if this information is accurate, and we can retrieve the full 60 days of data, we effectively possess the complete operational choreography of their nuclear deterrent in the Pacific. We will know where to find every boomer in the water, every minute of the day. This changes the entire calculus of the Cold War. The immediate order from the White House was simple. Operation Ivy Bells was to be classified beyond top secret, designated a Special Access Program, SAP, with controls stricter than nuclear launch codes. The program was to be fully funded and expanded. The success of Halibut meant that other, similar Soviet cables, in the Barents Sea, perhaps, or linking major air bases, could also be vulnerable. The 60-day interim was used by the National Security Agency, NSA, to create the necessary framework to instantly ingest and analyze the torrent of data expected from the first pod. A dedicated, highly secured facility was established, codenamed Warehouse, where cryptologists began the pre-work of breaking the F-800 cipher based on the small initial samples. The consensus was that the cipher, while robust, was mathematically breakable once they had the full body of text, proving the Soviet mistake of relying on physical, not electronic security. In Pearl Harbor, Commander Kavanaugh and the core crew of the Halibut prepared for the return trip. The stakes were now unimaginably high. They were no longer just testing a theory. They were safeguarding the primary intelligence stream of the entire U.S. military apparatus in the Pacific. The second mission, scheduled for mid-January 1972, would involve the perilous retrieval of the full data pod and the installation of a replacement pod, ensuring the TAP remained active for another 60 days. The fear was palpable. 60 days was plenty of time for Soviet naval patrols, trawlers, or deep-sea currents to have caused an incident. The possibility of finding the pod gone, or worse, finding a Soviet Navy vessel waiting for them, was a constant low-frequency hum of dread in the torpedo room. January 1972. The Sea of Okhotsk. The return journey 60 days later presented a radically different and far more lethal set of environmental challenges. The transition from late autumn to midwinter meant that large sections of the shallower Sea of Okhotsk were now covered in pack ice, some fields reaching thicknesses of several meters. This was, paradoxically, both a shield and a potentially fatal trap for the USS Halibut. The thick ice cover provided a superior acoustic camouflage, muffling the sounds of Halibut's slow movements and complicating the use of active sonar by Soviet surface vessels. However, it also meant that surfacing in an emergency was impossible, and the massive, groaning pressure of the ice masses created a constant, chaotic noise environment that made passive listening, their primary means of detection, difficult and unreliable. The threat of ice scoring their hull or blocking their egress was constant. Commander Kavanaugh guided the submarine back through the Kuriil Straits, moving even more slowly than the first time. The internal temperature of the sub dropped severely due to the surrounding near-freezing water, and the crew, now keenly aware of the massive intelligence payload they were seeking, were coiled tight with tension. Sonar reports heavy ice creaking and grinding overhead. Commander, reported Ensign Shun, his breath visible in the chilled control room. Noise level is high, masking the mid-frequency range. We've lost the ability to reliably track distant surface traffic, but the advantage is they've also lost us. The crucial test came as they entered Paradise Valley. The acoustic transponders deployed 2 months prior were their only beacon in the freezing darkness. Lieutenant Commander Thorne activated the specialized receiver on the SRV Fish remotely from the submerged halibut. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, a faint, rhythmic ping-ping-ping resolved from a noise. Commander, I have the array. Faint but clean. The transponders are active. Triangulation suggests the pod is exactly where we left it. Within 5 feet of the logged coordinates, Thorne announced, relief flooding his voice. Kavanaugh felt a wave of tension break. The pod had survived. The Soviet oversight had held. He immediately gave the command, bottom the boat. Standard procedure. Get the relief pod prepped and ready for deployment immediately upon recovery of the first unit. The halibut settled gently onto the silt bottom for the second time, the sounds of it settling masked by the distant groan of shifting ice. The operation this time was far more complex. They had to decouple the 6-ton recording pod, safely bring it into the hangar, and then immediately recouple the fresh replacement pod, all while remaining acoustically invisible to the Soviet patrol routes that crisscrossed the ice-covered sea above. Thorne deployed the RMV Claw once more. The visibility was poorer than before. The winter currents had stirred up more glacial sediment. But Thorne knew the geometry now. On the monitor, the large, dark, cylindrical shape of the pod appeared, sitting undisturbed on the cable, looking like a natural, iron-rich rock formation. The sight was stunning, a monument to American audacity and Soviet strategic overconfidence. The challenge lay in the precise decoupling maneuver. If the Claw applied force incorrectly, it risked damaging the delicate induction coil interface, potentially leaving behind evidence of the tap on the K200 cable itself. That risk was unacceptable. The secrets held within the 60 days of magnetic tape were worth the danger, but discovery meant the immediate cessation of the flow of intelligence, and perhaps a fatal confrontation. The dance of the Claw began again, slower and more nerve-wracking than the first time. Lieutenant Commander Thorne guided the RMV Claw with the concentration of a bomb disposal expert. He manipulated the hydraulic arms, gently engaging the safety override release mechanism on the pod's clamp. This mechanism had been designed with an internal acoustic dampener, ensuring that the critical moment of release, the snap of the heavy titanium jaws disengaging, would not travel through the water column. 09:30 hours. Thorne gave the silent command. The screen showed the minute rotation of the locking bolts. The Claw's main arm was braced against the seabed, providing a counter-tension to stabilize the pod. For 15 excruciating minutes, the team watched the monitors. Finally, the status light on the pod's telemetry shifted from green, clamped, to amber, released. Pod is decoupled, Commander, Thorne announced, his voice tight with controlled excitement. Commencing recovery. The 6-ton cylinder, heavy with 60 days of Soviet naval secrets, was slowly reeled back toward the open hangar bay of the USS Halibut. As the pod was safely secured within the pressurized lockout chamber, a wave of palpable relief swept through the control room. The first half of the mission, the successful retrieval of the intelligence, was complete. Immediately, the second phase began. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan's team had already brought the fresh replacement pod, Pod 2, to the edge of the hangar bay. They wasted no time deploying it. Thorne maneuvered the Claw, secured the new pod, and with practiced efficiency, guided it toward the exposed section of the 200 cable. The installation of the second pod took less than half the time of the original deployment, a testament to the crew's hard-won experience. By 11 o'clock hours, Pod 2 was firmly clamped, transmitting a clean signal back to Halibut's temporary monitor. It was during the final confirmation of the new pod status that Ensign Chun, who had been constantly monitoring the passive hydrophones, reported a critical change in the acoustic environment. Commander, a new contact. Bearing 005, ring operator, very slow for knots. Classification is unclear, but the acoustic signature is unique. It's a very low, almost scraping sound, not a propeller cavitation. It's coming from the northeast, heading right for the K-200's general run. Kavanaugh moved to the sonar repeater. What is it, Chun? A trawler? A submarine? Negative, sir. The sound profile is too uniform, too mechanical. It sounds like something being towed or dragging across the bottom, but the noise level is exceptionally low, indicating great care or specialized equipment. Range 10 miles and closing slowly. The course is 220 ring operator, exactly along the path of the cable. A cold knot formed in Kavanaugh's stomach. The Soviet Navy did not randomly deploy specialized deep-sea equipment in the middle of their primary SSBN operating area. This scraping sound could only mean one thing: a cable maintenance or inspection vessel. The Soviets had not detected the pod in the 60 days it had been recording, but they were now conducting an inspection sweep. It was an appalling stroke of bad luck. The timing was too close for comfort. Halibut was bottomed, completely vulnerable, and now directly in the path of a Soviet vessel that could potentially find their newly installed pod in a matter of hours. Sullivan, prepare to surface the boat silently. Immediate departure. Chun, give me a precise time to closest point of approach for that contact, Kavanaugh ordered, his voice suddenly sharp and demanding. The euphoria of the successful retrieval vanished, replaced by the immediate, chilling threat of discovery. They had 10 miles and the thickness of the frozen sea ice between them and a catastrophic Cold War incident. Ensign Chin's fingers flew across the keyboard, running trajectory calculations based on the Soviet contact's slow, steady 4-knot speed. Closest point of approach, CPA, in 2 hours and 10 minutes, Commander. Their course takes them directly over the tap site. Based on the hydrophone signature, that scraping noise sounds like a bottom-towed inspection sled, likely equipped with high-resolution magnetic anomaly detectors and possibly a remotely operated vehicle. They're looking for something abnormal on the cable. The situation was dire. Halibut was a 5,000-ton inert mass, sitting on the bottom, having just manipulated a section of the cable. Even with the new pod's advanced acoustic masking, the slight disturbance in the silt, the minuscule magnetic signature of the recently installed device, or the brief, high-frequency sound of the RMB claw, operating could be enough for the Soviet inspection gear to register an anomaly. We cannot risk discovery, Kavanaugh stated, his eyes locked on the CPA plot. A Soviet vessel finding a sophisticated American tapping device on their primary nuclear command link. That is an act of war. We disappear now. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan directed the silent departure. This was far more difficult than the first time. They had only just bottomed, and the ambient temperature was colder, meaning the hull was contracting and expanding subtly. He used the trim system with micro-adjustments, injecting tiny bursts of air into the ballast tanks to achieve positive buoyancy, lifting the submarine fractionally off the bottom without generating the telltale rush of displaced sediment. The 350-foot submarine lifted off the seabed like a massive, reluctant ghost. Kavanaugh maintained a zero-speed drift for the first 10 minutes, allowing the water currents to carry them a few hundred yards away from the immediate tap site. Helm, engage main propulsion. Crawl speed, 0.5 knots. Take us 90 ring operator off the contact's bearing, directly east. We need to hug the underside of the continental shelf ridge. Use that rock formation for acoustic shadow, Kavanaugh commanded. The urgency was masked by the low, even tone of his voice, but the entire crew understood the stakes. They were moving at half a knot, a snail's pace, with a Soviet inspection sweep closing in on their exact recent location. The scraping noise of the Soviet deep-sea sled grew, resolving into a distinct, repetitive shush 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 on the hydrophones. It was a terrifying metronome counting down to potential discovery. They were still only 8 miles away when Chun reported a change in the contact's behavior. "Commander, the contact has slowed to 2 knots. It's deploying something else." Another acoustic source, low frequency, suggesting an active pinger or a bottom profiler. The 220 ring operator course remains constant, directly on the K-200 cable line. Kavanaugh's mind raced. The Soviet vessel was now actively searching. They couldn't outrun it, and they couldn't risk detection. Their only safety lay in the acoustic chaos of the environment and the absolute silence of their execution. He ordered the reactor cooling pumps, the quietest system on a nuclear sub, to be temporarily cycled to an even slower rate, sacrificing heat management for stealth. As the 2-hour mark approached, the Soviet contact was just 3 miles away, its proximity indicated by the sharp, clear sound of the scraping sled. Kavanaugh, watching the bathymetric chart, ordered the halibut into a small, deep depression near the shelf edge, hoping to use the geological feature as a final acoustic curtain. The submarine lay motionless once again, using only the passive current to hold its position, the crew's collective heart beating in time with the ominous shush 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 of the approaching Soviet secret sweeper. The 60 days of priceless intelligence, now safely secured in the hull, felt like a massive burden, a weight that could drag them to the bottom of the Cold War ocean. The 120 minutes that followed were defined by sensory overload and absolute physical stillness inside the USS Halibut. The deep depression Kavanaugh had chosen was only marginally larger than the submarine itself, providing a brief, acoustic shadow from the direct path of the Soviet sweeper. Every man not essential to the minimal control functions was ordered to sit or lie down, minimizing movement, minimizing sound. The only personnel active were Commander Kavanaugh, Chief Sullivan, Ensign Chun on hydrophones, and Lieutenant Commander Thorne, who was nervously monitoring the acoustic profile of the newly installed Pod 2. The scraping, mechanical sound of the Soviet inspection sled intensified, dominating the acoustic space. Ensign Chun adjusted the hydrophone gain, trying to isolate the distinct frequencies of the Soviet vessel's hull from the towed sled. "Commander, the acoustic profile is clarifying. The towing vessel is a small, specialized Project 1690 Crab class survey ship. It's designed for bottom work and cable repair. And the sled, it's a MMS-2 deep tow unit. It has both magnetic and seismic profilers. This isn't a passive sweep. They are actively mapping the cable's path for anomalies." The crab was now less than 2 miles away. At this range and shallow depth, any minute sound from halibut, a pump kicking on, a tool dropping, or a crewman shifting weight, could be fatal. The pressure of the moment was so immense it seemed to push the air out of the room. The halibut, designed to be a hunter, was reduced to a frightened, massive piece of metal hiding under a rock. Then came the moment of maximum danger. The crab passed directly overhead, its propeller cavitation a deep, vibrating rumble felt through halibut's hull itself. The noise of the MMS, 2 sleds scraped past, a grating, metallic whisper that seemed to hover inches above the control room. "The sled is directly over the tapped coordinates, Commander," Chun whispered, his voice barely audible. "They are sitting on top of where we were 90 minutes ago. And they're slowing. They've detected something." A wave of cold dread washed over the crew. Kavanaugh held his breath, his eyes fixed on Chun. "Wait." "Negative, Commander," Chun immediately corrected, his voice tinged with immense relief. "The sled has registered a minor magnetic anomaly, but it's consistent with the low, residual magnetic signature we left on the sediment for bottoming. The signature dissipates within 30 seconds. They are proceeding. They have not lingered. They are passing over the new pod site now." The 6-ton Pod 2, now clamped to the cable, was doing its job. Its specialized titanium shell and acoustic dampeners were mimicking a natural deep-sea rock, fooling the Soviet MS-2 profiler. The faint scraping sound of the sled continued past them, diminishing slowly toward the southwest. For 30 minutes after the closest point of approach, Kavanaugh kept the submarine dead silent. Only when the crab's acoustic signature had faded to the range of 5 miles did he allow the slightest movement. "Sullivan, give me 1 knot," dead silent. "We move east, away from the cable line. We will not use the Kuril Straits. We will take the long, deep way out through the 3,000-meter abyssal plain. I don't want to encounter another patrol ship or ice trap," Kavanaugh commanded, the raw tension finally leaching from his voice. The successful evasion was a testament to the crew's discipline and the efficacy of the pod's acoustic and magnetic camouflage. They had been within feet of a Soviet inspection, yet they had escaped with the most important intelligence haul of the decade. The 60 days of tape, now safely stored in the inner core of the halibut, contained the true, unvarnished story of Soviet nuclear command structure. The secrets were secured. The halibut was now steaming toward a rendezvous that would unleash a firestorm in Washington, D.C. The transit out of the Sea of Okhotsk took 7 agonizing days, navigating the deep water routes far from the usual shipping lanes and acoustic barriers. Commander Kavanaugh bypassed Pearl Harbor entirely. The secrecy of this payload was considered so paramount that the USS Halibut was routed directly to a highly secure, covert facility near San Francisco Bay, known only by its operational alias, the Vault. On January 29, 1972, Halibut surfaced in the dead of night, not alongside a naval pier, but inside a massive, camouflaged dry dock specifically built to handle the most sensitive intelligence retrievals. The atmosphere was unlike any naval docking. There were no tugs, no dock workers, only a squad of heavily armed Marines and a handful of individuals in civilian clothes who held security clearances beyond the highest naval ranks. The operation was immediate and swift. The 6-ton pod, still sealed, was carefully extracted from the converted hangar bay. It was then immediately transferred, under constant armed guard, to a special container that electronically monitored for vibration, pressure, and temperature. This container was flown by a dedicated military transport, with a fighter escort, to the NSA's warehouse facility outside of Washington, D.C. Aboard Halibut, Commander Kavanaugh and Lieutenant Voss were quickly debriefed by Vice Admiral Bobby Inman himself, flown in specifically for this purpose. Inman's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were wide with anticipation. "Voss, the tapes. What is the preliminary assessment now that you've physically handled the unit?" Inman asked, standing in the cramped wardroom, which was now protected by temporary security detail. Voss, visibly exhausted but energized by the mission's success, pointed to a small, thermal-sensitive indicator on the recovered pod's outer casing. "Admiral, the temperature remained constant. No intrusion, no failure. The real counter indicates maximum recording capacity was reached and shut down perfectly. We estimate we have a solid 60 days of continuous, high-density traffic, voice, and data from the moment we clamped it on." The sheer volume of data was staggering. 60 days of continuous communications from the very heart of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The intelligence community had been starved for information about the precise command and control of the Soviet nuclear deterrent. They had relied on educated guesswork, high-altitude surveillance, and sporadic human sources. This single retrieval would provide 60 times more actionable intelligence than they had acquired in the previous decade combined. Upon arrival at the NSA's warehouse, the atmosphere was electric. The highly secured facility, built deep underground, was staffed by the country's most brilliant cryptologists, linguists, and signals analysts. The pod was carefully cracked open in a clean room, and the enormous spools of high-quality magnetic tape, miles of it, were loaded into specially modified playback and decryption machines. The decryption process began immediately, focusing first on the high-priority voice communication channels. The early samples had confirmed the use of the flawed F-800 cipher. Within 48 hours, the NSA achieved the breakthrough. They had the cipher key logic locked down, and the continuous stream of Soviet command voice traffic began to resolve into clear, actionable speech. The first full transcript translated and presented to the U.S. Navy Chief of Operations was a detailed 3-week-long schedule for the deployment, patrol, and maintenance of the Yankee-class ballistic missile submarines. It specified exact transit routes through known geographic choke points, the planned length of their patrol boxes, and, most shocking of all, the precise times and methods of communication with Moscow Command, the very moments the 16-missile boat was most vulnerable to acoustic tracking. The Soviet commanders, confident in their physical security, were discussing their nuclear deterrent movements as if they were on an open, unmonitored telephone line. The American reaction was not just triumph, but a genuine sense of shock at the depth of the Soviet vulnerability. The torrent of intelligence that flowed from the 60 days of magnetic tape, the vault, immediately transformed U.S. naval strategy in the Pacific. The intelligence was categorized into 3 critical areas: nuclear posture, acoustic surveillance, and operational doctrine. Under nuclear posture, the transcripts provided the American command with confirmation of the Soviet SSBN ship's submersible ballistic nuclear patrol cycle vulnerabilities. They learned the precise depth at which the Yankee and Delta-class submarines preferred to communicate with Moscow and, crucially, the 48-hour window during which the crews rotated maintenance duty, a time of maximum distraction and reduced alertness. This information allowed U.S. attack submarines, primarily the Permit and Sturgeon classes, to sanctuary track, to position themselves in the expected patrol boxes before the Soviet SSBNs arrived, ensuring they could maintain continuous tracking for the entire deployment without being detected themselves. This capability guaranteed that in a crisis, the U.S. could neutralize a significant portion of the Soviet Pacific nuclear deterrent, effectively shifting the strategic balance of power at sea. The data on acoustic surveillance was equally transformative. The Soviets had deployed an extensive deep-sea listening array, their own version of the American SOSUS network, around the approaches to the Sea of Okhotsk, designed to detect and track any American submarine intrusion. The communications from the K-200 cable contained detailed logs of the array status, its precise location, the depths of its hydrophones, its sensitivities, and, most importantly, the exact downtime for maintenance and calibration. The U.S. Navy immediately developed new, ultra-silent transit routes, threading the needle through the Soviet acoustic curtain during these known, predictable downtime windows. The Sea of Okhotsk, which the Soviets believed was their secure, acoustic bastion, was now revealed to be riddled with known blind spots for American subs. Finally, the information on operational doctrine was unprecedented. The voice traffic often included and censored candid conversations between Soviet commanders, including Admiral Gennady Lebedev, the commander of the Kamchatka flotilla. These talks revealed critical details about Soviet naval culture, their reliance on centralized command and control, their rigid adherence to preset schedules, and the occasional lapses in security when senior officers grew complacent or relied too heavily on automation. The CIA and naval intelligence used this data to create detailed psychological and operational profiles, predicting Soviet responses to various U.S. maneuvers and geopolitical events. The success of Halibut, the sheer audacity of Operation Ivy Bells, was now the basis for a sustained, high-risk intelligence program. Within 6 months, the USS Parcha, a specialized submarine even more advanced than Halibut, was being refitted to take over the recurring tap and retrieval mission. The program was so successful, and the intelligence flow so vital, that subsequent retrieval missions were executed multiple times a year, in all seasons, deep within the Sea of Okhotsk. The most shocking realization for American intelligence was the depth of Soviet faith in their physical security. The very idea that a foreign power could physically tap a heavily armored cable on the seabed in a protected military zone was beyond the bounds of Soviet strategic paranoia. They were victims of their own geographic arrogance. They had built a steel vault around an open filing cabinet. This strategic advantage, however, came with a terrible caveat: the absolute necessity of maintaining the Soviets' profound ignorance. If Moscow ever discovered the tap, the flow of secrets would stop instantly, and the resulting geopolitical crisis would be immediate and severe. The existence of Operation Ivy Bells became a secret more precious than nuclear launch codes. Operation Ivy Bells transformed from a single, high-risk mission into a highly classified, biannual naval ritual. Every 60 to 90 days, depending on the treacherous seasonal conditions of the Sea of Okhotsk, a specially modified submarine, initially the USS Halibut, and later the more advanced USS Parcha, would undertake the long, silent transit back into the Soviet backyard. The routine became a masterpiece of discipline and stealth. The submarine would creep back into Paradise Valley, using the buried acoustic transponders to home in on the exact coordinates. They would bottom the boat, deploy the RMV Claw, and execute the meticulous 4-hour swap procedure. First, decoupling the fully recorded pod, securing it inside the hull, and then immediately clamping a fresh replacement pod onto the K200 cable. The goal was always the same: perfect execution with zero evidence left behind. The constant vigilance was a matter of national security. Every Soviet acoustic irregularity, every shift in the bottom current, every faint magnetic anomaly was scrutinized by the American crew. For nearly a decade, from 1972 through 1981, the intelligence flow was constant and unparalleled. The tapes provided not just high-level strategic information, but the mundane, day-to-day administrative data that build a complete picture of Soviet vulnerability. Analysts in the warehouse facility were able to compile massive databases detailing the names of key commanders, their leadership styles, the operational limits of their equipment, like the maximum speed at which a Yankee class could operate without making a detectable noise signature, and even the specific acoustic signatures of individual ships based on maintenance records discussing propeller wear or engine tuning. The data had real-world, immediate impact. When a Soviet SSBN suddenly went silent or changed its patrol behavior, the U.S. Navy could instantly cross-reference the change with the deciphered K200 traffic, understanding why the shift occurred. Whether it was a genuine tactical maneuver or a simple mechanical failure mentioned by commander in a voice transmission. This allowed the U.S. to operate with a near-perfect understanding of Soviet intentions, minimizing the risk of miscalculation during moments of heightened tension. Crucially, the continued success of the TAP led the Soviet Navy to believe their physical security was absolute, causing a profound strategic blindness. They never invested heavily in advanced cryptographic security for the K200 cable, continuing to rely on the predictable, breakable F800 cipher for the most sensitive command traffic. To the Soviet admirals in Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk, the idea that an American vessel could sit 460 meters below the surface, year after year, and steal their secrets was an unimaginable impossibility. Their confidence was the Americans' greatest shield. The commanders of the mission, like Kavanaugh and those who followed, became legends within the deep, compartmentalized security corridors of the U.S. intelligence community, though their names and exploits remained completely unknown to the public. They were the Cold War's true phantoms, navigating a constant, existential danger for an intelligence dividend that was reshaping the global balance of power. The tiny, silent pod, sitting on the bottom of a hostile sea, represented a decisive, technological victory that the Soviets couldn't even comprehend, much less counter. This silence, this decade of profound operational ignorance on the part of the Soviets, was the ultimate goal of Operation Ivy Bells. The profound operational silence surrounding Operation Ivy Bells was shattered not by a Soviet patrol or by a mechanical failure 460 meters below the Sea of Okhotsk, but by the betrayal of a single man in Washington, D.C. For 10 years, the secret had been held inviolate by thousands of Navy personnel and intelligence analysts, a testament to the iron grip of the SAP Special Access Program security protocols. Yet, all that discipline and risk was undone by greed. In 1980, the Soviet KGB office in Washington, D.C., received an extraordinary proposition. A 44-year-old petty officer named Ronald Pelton, a highly decorated former communications specialist with the National Security Agency, NSA, walked into the Soviet embassy and offered to sell America's most precious secrets. Pelton had been privy to the NSA's deepest classified programs, including the code name and general purpose of Operation Ivy Bells, which he learned during his brief time working near the warehouse facility. Pelton, disillusioned, financially ruined, and seeking a massive payoff, met with KGB officers in Vienna in January 1981. He didn't know the precise coordinates of the tap, nor the technical specifications of the pod, but he provided the most damning detail: the location of the K-200 cable, the fact that it was being tapped by a highly modified U.S. submarine in the Sea of Okhotsk, and, critically, the fact that the Soviets' most sensitive communications were being compromised due to their reliance on the F-800 cipher. The information Pelton provided was initially treated with skepticism by the KGB leadership. The audacity of the claim seemed too fantastic to be true. But the pieces of the puzzle aligned too perfectly with known gaps in their security analyses. Moscow immediately deployed a Project 1690 Crab-class survey ship, the very type the halibut had evaded years earlier, to conduct a meticulous, multi-spectrum sweep of the K-200 cable using advanced, high-resolution magnetic sensing. October 1981. The Soviet survey ship, moving with pinpoint precision to the coordinates of the K-200 line, quickly registered a series of unmistakable magnetic anomalies. After an initial search, a heavy-duty Soviet deep-sea submersible was deployed. Within hours, the submersible located the tap site and confirmed the existence of a sophisticated titanium cylindrical device clamped to the cable. It was the latest generation of the pod, having just completed another 90-day recording cycle, filled with the latest secrets of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Soviet High Command. The realization that the Americans had been listening to their most protected nuclear command network for a decade was catastrophic. The Soviet commanders were reportedly in a state of utter shock, realizing their faith in the impregnability of the Sea of Okhotsk had been a monumental, fatal strategic blunder. Moscow immediately cut the K-200 cable, retrieving the American pod as conclusive proof. The device was shipped to the KGB's Technical Analysis Laboratories, where Soviet engineers meticulously reverse-engineered the advanced tapping technology. The loss of the intelligence stream was immediate, and the U.S. Navy was forced to acknowledge the catastrophic compromise. The next submarine sent for the retrieval mission, the USS Parche, found a clean, newly laid cable in a heavily patrolled, heavily monitored seabed where the tap site had been. The decades-long stream of secrets was finished. The impact of the discovery was twofold. The U.S. had lost its most valuable intelligence asset, but the Soviets gained the profound realization of their vulnerability. They immediately overhauled their communication security, retiring the flawed F-800 cipher and initiating a massive, expensive program to secure all their critical undersea links. Ronald Pelton's betrayal had prematurely ended the greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War, but the 10 years of information harvested by the tiny American submarine had already fundamentally reshaped the strategic balance, arming the U.S. with knowledge that had been crucial in navigating the most perilous years of the nuclear standoff. The price of the pod was heavy, but the intelligence already secured was invaluable.